Okay guys, so just following up from last week's tutorial, this is we're still dealing with question 5 here on the composing paper. First of all, just a couple of very quick points before I move on to this tutorial. By now you'll all heard about the news about the practical exams, which is fantastic news altogether. So you're going into this exam with 50% of your marks already in the bag, so it's great. This presents a really good opportunity for you guys to maximize your marks here. So you've got to put as much work as you can into this composing paper. It's a huge opportunity to get a really good mark. Okay, so so I've received prep back from most of you. If you haven't, I do have to stop taking the prep at this point. I've got a lot of corrections building up. So if you miss the deadline, I'll be pretty flexible with you. If you know you're going to miss a deadline, just let me know. In these circumstances, it's totally understandable. Some of you have limited Wi-Fi access and so on, but let me know. If I don't know, if I haven't heard from you, if you've made no attempt at communication at all, and you missed the deadline, and a few days go by, it's just the work is considered not assessed. You can't hand it in to me 3 or 4 weeks down the road, because at that stage I'll have moved on. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a couple of points from the exercise we did last week. Okay, so we did an exercise from the 2017 Leaving Cert composing paper, and this was backing chords and bass line in a major key. Now, I just want to stress something here, guys. This is the last example I'm going to do using the major key. I need to move on to the minor key. You never know from one year to the next what's going to come up, whether it's the major key or the minor key. It could be either. It seems to be like the minor key comes up more often. That's not something to be intimidated by. Most of the rules are still the same for writing in the minor key as they will be for writing in the major key. But this is the last example I'm going to do using the major key. We need to move on. Please feel free to email me directly as well away from the classroom if you have any questions. Okay, so just a couple of things, few common mistakes from the first ones. Now, when I say common mistakes, these, like, most of these exercises were quite good. Well done to you. Of the mistakes that were made, these are the ones that were most common. So, use of unacceptable chord progressions. So, for example, going from 2 to 1. It's an unacceptable chord progression. And just to clarify, like in modern pop music, for example, that's a chord sequence that can be used quite often. So let's say, again, using the key of C as an example, D minor to C. It's not unheard of in modern music, okay? But we are dealing with 18th century harmony rules here. That's the rules we're using for writing these, okay? So just watch out for that. And again, in a major key, avoiding chords 3 and 7, and so on. Okay, doubling the thirds. Now, this is something we were touching on just just before the school broke up. So doubling the third means basically if the chord you've chosen in the melody line has the third note, the major third note of the chord in it, don't use the first inversion of that chord. So quite simply, again, using the key of C, if the note E is in the melody line, do not use chord 1B or C over E, because the bass note will be the same as the melody note and it's unacceptable. Now, when I say it's unacceptable musically to your ear, it won't sound incorrect. Two E's will obviously, they're the same note, an octave apart. They blend perfectly well. But using these rules, it's not accepted and it would be considered a wrong chord. So you'd be marked wrong. Okay, I've put in weak chord progressions here as well. So chord progressions that are not necessarily unacceptable. So, for example, 2 to 1. If you use the chord 2 to 1, the chord sequence 2 to 1, that will be marked wrong. But again, weak chord progressions, and I've put on a sheet here and I uploaded it in the last presentation, and I'll put it up in the drive as well. Just chords that are, generally speaking, like, while they're not incorrect and wrong, just don't work particularly strongly. Stuff like, moving up in thirds, going 2 to 4, 4 to 6, 6 to 2, and so on. Just watch out for these. And again, like using chord 3, like, for example, there are cases where chord 3 might work, like 1 3 4 5 is a very strong chord sequence, and there could be an occasion where that might work, but again, anytime using chord 3, for example, is not good, and it's not on the syllabus, so you're not expected to know it anyway. Weak chord progressions comes into the quality of chord progressions, which I'll speak about in a moment. Bass notes not matching chords. Now, guys, in my opinion, this is unforgivable. the bass note that you put in your bass line must match the bass note or root note of the chord you've indicated. So again, if the chord is C, the bass note must be C. If the chord is D, the bass note must be D. And then in an inverted chord, so let's say 1B, a chord of C/E or C over E, the bass note must be E. Whatever's to the right of the slash, that's what your bass note must be. You should really consider maybe just sketching that in as you go along. But really, I mean, it's completely unforgivable in my opinion not to get that right. Once you know the notes of your bass, notes in the bass clef, and you've chosen the chord on top, you have to, you should be able to match it up quite easily. And just one small little side point on that though, even if the chord you've chosen is incorrect, you won't get marks for the bass note. So if, for example, you're in the key of C and you've used the chord of 7, which is B diminished, even if you've got B in the bass line, you won't get marks for that because a diminished chord is not on the syllabus. It's not likely to work anywhere in the major key. Okay, and then bass line not reflecting the given opening. We need to deal with this a little bit more, guys. So the bass line, basically not looking at the given opening and basing your bass line on that. Some of you wrote, okay, nice bass lines, but they bore no resemblance to what you were given at the start, and that is important. Okay, so we'll deal with that a little bit later. Just to show you how this is marked, there are 4 criteria in the marking scheme here. The chord you choose, and this is normally marked out of 23. Quality of chord progressions, which is normally marked out of 13. Bass notes, which is normally marked out of 12, and the quality of the bass line, which is normally marked out of, I think, 12 as well. It's in total it's 60 anyway. So it's just sometimes the way the marks are broken down within these 4 criteria vary from year to year, but it is always out of 60. So looking at the prep example that we did here, okay, so most of you again were quite comfortable with this. None of you that sent me in prep are wildly off track here, so well done. Just important as well, read the instructions. I mentioned this in the last tutorial, but don't just start diving into it. Just take a moment to read the question. Okay, so just looking at the 4 points here, study the piece of music below. Insert suitable bass notes and chord indications in the style of the given opening. Do not use the same chord in the same position in adjacent bars, and you may use either chord symbols or Roman numerals, but not both. For the remainder of this tutorial, guys, if you could have this paper with you or this exercise with you, it's not going to remain on the screen. So pause this if you want and go and get your exercise. So the first thing you have to do: insert suitable bass notes, insert chords into the boxes along the top. Now I've given you chords here that will work. There are other options available to you here, and perhaps stronger options available to you here, guys. Okay, but it's important that once the chord you use is correct and works, you will get marks unless it is part of a forbidden progression. So if you use chord 2 and it works, that's fine. But if the following chord is chord 1, you will lose marks for either chord 2 or chord 1. You won't get marks for both of those because it's not an acceptable progression. And I've got a list of these here. So the chords I've given you here, there may be alternatives. I haven't put in too many inversions there, in fact, so just keep that in mind. Inversions can 1B and so on can help, and can really work nicely for the bass line as well. So just keep in mind that inversions can be good to use. This is the sheet I put on. This is from the Higgins book. This is an excellent guide to what chords are strong and what chords are weak. Do use this. It's on the drive, print it out, and I would say very important, memorize it, guys. Some things work well when you just memorize them, learn it from rote. I'm not going to dwell on this here. You can just look at this yourself in your own time, print it off, whatever you're comfortable doing. Okay, unacceptable chord progressions. I mentioned this, okay? So just to quickly go through, this is actually from the SEC, the State Exams Commission, and this is part of the marking scheme. So people marking the sheet, marking your papers rather, are told to watch out for this stuff. This comes directly from the marking scheme. So same chord in adjacent box is not accepted unless the bass note is changed. So if you're changing from 1 to 1B, for example, or you've added the 7th. So if you're going from 5 to 5/7, for example, it's not considered the same chord. Marks for chords not awarded in isolation. Chords must be part of a good progression. So what that means is, again, I spent it earlier on. Let's say, for example, that the exercise we worked on here is in the key of A flat major. So chord 2 is B flat minor. and that might be correct with the note below. You might have a B flat in the bass line, so you might think, okay, B flat minor will work very well here. But if the next chord is the chord of 1, or as an A flat in the bass and you choose to use the chord of 1, that's not an acceptable chord progression. So you will not get the marks for one of those chords. You'll be given the marks for one of them, but depending on which is the least musical of them, you'll lose marks for that one. And then very quickly, 4 little bullet points here. 5 to 5 7. Sorry, 5 7 to 5, not accepted. Now, just to point out, 5 to 5 7 is very good. Don't use 5 7 as the last chord in a cadence. So, for example, let's say we have an imperfect cadence going going to 5. Anything going to 5, don't make that 5 5 7. Right, make it a 5. Okay, 2 to 1 or 2B to 1, not accepted. Simple as that, just not accepted. Now this is the major key we're dealing with here. Accept as an approach chord to 1C in cadential 6/4. 6/4 I'll be dealing with in a different tutorial. Cadential 6/4 is basically where you kind of slightly decorate the chord of 5 by raising the top two notes, the third and the fifth, up one step. Before resolving back down to the full chord of 5. I will deal with that in a separate tutorial now. You don't really need to be too aware of that now, and it wasn't an issue for most of you. And if we are using cadential 6/4, cadential 6/4 must be on the stronger of the two beats and at a cadence point. Again, I will deal with that later. And chords that cause weak bass lines, augmented fourths / diminished fifths, not accepted. Simple as that. Okay. This is a small thing about cadential 6/4. If you want, you can pause this and take a moment to read it. Not dealing with it now. We'll deal with it in a later tutorial. It's a nice little composing tool. So if you can get the grips, it's great. But for the moment, you don't need it. Bass notes. So usually marked out of 12, and I did mention this earlier on. They can, this can change. So I've seen New Year's where it's marked out of 13, some nights marked out of 12. It does vary. Either way, the whole question is marked out of 60, and regardless of whether this is marked out of 12 or 13, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. So half a mark for every correct note. Marks only awarded if selected chord is correct. Avoid doubling the thirds. We spoke about this earlier on. If the major third is in the melody line, don't use 1B. Okay, make sure you haven't got so for example, using the chord of C, or in this case, we were in the key of A flat. So if C is in the melody line, don't use 1B, A flat over C, as your accompanying chord. So this means that if the melody that should say note, I apologize, note is the major third of the chord, do not use the first inversion of this chord. Minor thirds are fine, by the way. Okay. Avoid consecutive fifths and octaves. So for example, if you are, again, key of C, if you have the note C in the melody line and you're using C in the bass, that on itself is okay. But if, for example, the next chord is a D minor and you have a D in the melody and a D in the bass, that's not okay. That's consecutive octaves. Likewise, let's say you had a G in the melody line and you use C, the chord of 1 in the key of C, for the bass note, and the next chord is D minor. If the melody note is an A, don't use a D in the bass there. That's consecutive fifths. Okay, and again, guys, at any time, pause this, rewind it, go back over it, or contact me directly if you need any clarification on anything. Quality of the bass line, again, usually marked out of 13. Okay, now guys, this is probably the place where most of you need to have a look. So and I'll develop this a bit more in our next tutorial. Have a look at the bass line of the given opening and consider using this as a template. Now this is really important, guys. Some of you did write really intricate, complicated bass lines, which were quite good in isolation, but not necessarily a reflection of the given opening. It has to suit the piece of music, and again, you're not writing counterpoint here, you're not harmonizing every note that's go along, just a nice simple accompanying line. So for example, this is point 2. In the 2017 example, there were 2 crotchets, an octave, sorry, apologies for the spelling there, an octave apart, followed by an arpeggio of the next chord using 2 quavers and a crotchet. So it's a nice simple motif. Use it. Carry on using this pattern. This would have been nice, and a lot of you actually spotted this and did it, so well done. Then maybe change it if there's a B phrase. So if the music goes in a different direction at line 3, for example, maybe simplify it, just go to a simpler rhythm if you want, but not necessarily. Avoid using awkward leaps, so don't jump up sevenths, rising thirds, falling fourths, so on. And a jump of an octave is okay. Don't do any more than that. Okay, we don't want to a bit of a yo-yo effect going on here. Again, avoid augmented fourths and diminished fifths. That's in the baseline, and generally keep it simple. You are writing a bass accompaniment and not a sorry for the harmony, for the spelling mistakes, contrapuntal harmony line. That's counterpoint harmony line. You're not writing a harmony line here. You're writing an accompanying bass line. Okay, so your prep for next week will be to the 2014 Leaving Cert paper. I'll upload this to Google Classroom and Google Drive. I'll email it on as well.